R.E. Hobart provides an argument for compatibilism and against libertarianism. He also draws out some implications for his view in terms of punishment. So let's get to the details. First of all, how does he define compatibilism? Well, this is a very standard way of thinking of compatibilism. We're talking about free will and determinism. And he says the two positions are entirely consistent. They can both be true. You can have free will even if fully determinist world exists. And Hobart argues that in fact, not only are these consistent, but freedom requires determinism. And throughout the process, he claims that we don't change any meaning of free will. We're just using the natural meaning of the term, and that we have free will is just a fact of our experience. We recognize it, we enjoy free will, and it's clear that we have it. Now, why not think that free will is like the libertarian says, who says that this requires an indeterministic world? Well, for Hobart, the libertarian is confused about what freedom is. And for his view of freedom, he's saying that if I'm the source of my action, then my action is determined by my character. So you see how character has to determine one's action, which means that you need determinism. Now, an underlying assumption here is that causation of any kind is going to imply determinism. So when you have causation existing, then there is determinism. Now, this is an assumption that libertarians would typically argue against this idea, but Hobart says it's pretty clear that it's true. So he is using this as an assumption in his work. So how does this play out? Well, if you call somebody good, for example, you say that their character is good, you claim that, and you say that the actions are caused or, of course, determined by their character. And so if you're praising someone, if you're saying they're a good person, they've done good things, you're saying they have a good character, and that has determined their actions. And so we have freedom and responsibility consistent with determinism. Now, here's how he argues against libertarianism. Recall, of course, libertarianism says that freedom and indeterminism is compatible and freedom and determinism is not. A libertarian is an incompatibilist. And here's what he does. He sets up a dilemma. He says there's a dilemma facing the proponent of indeterministic freedom, which he doesn't use the term libertarianism, but that's what he is referring to. And so we start with this idea that either one's actions are determined or they are not. Seems perfectly reasonable. If they are determined, well, then there's no indeterministic freedom and libertarianism is false. So if we take that horn of the dilemma, libertarianism is false. If they are not determined, then here's the problem, right? The action is rootless or sourceless. It has no basis. That means it's outside of one's control. And of course, if an action is not within one's control, if it's outside one's control, then that is not a free action. And so from this, we can conclude that libertarianism is false. So there is no indeterministic freedom of the will. So if we think there is freedom of the will, it has to be within a deterministic framework. And let's look then at the positive argument for compatibilism. Well, he starts by saying, look, to be free to do an action X implies that one has the ability to do it. One can do X, okay? And then, of course, if one can do X, then one has the power to do X, this capacity, this power to do X. And if one has the power to do X, then there has to be a law relating a person and doing X. So this is what he thinks about power in general, right? Power implies this causal connection. And since causality is deterministic, we have that tight connection now. And so to be free to do X, you run through that hypothetical syllogism that implies that there are deterministic laws. And so freedom is compatible with determinism, right? So we have that connection going, right? Freedom implies ability, which implies power, and power means that there's a law, and the laws have to be deterministic in order to work, and so freedom's compatible with determinism. Now, a question that someone might ask is, what about the ability to do otherwise, or ATDO, as I like to call it? So typically, when we think about freedom, we think about options, we think about choices, we think about the ability to do one thing, and then looking backwards, we think, well, I had the ability to do otherwise. I could have done something else. We think that when we believe that we are free. But that doesn't seem to be consistent with determinism. So here's what Hobart claims. He claims, yes, in fact, we do have the ATDO. We have that ability. And one doesn't have to add this phrase such as if one had wanted to. One could have done otherwise if one had wanted to, which Stace and some other compatibilists seem to think that you do need to add. Stace says, no, you don't need to add that phrase. Now, this sounds like exactly what the libertarian would want, but then he goes on to explain why he wouldn't add that. Why not? Because you assume that if you had wanted to, you could have done otherwise, right? The hypothetical, if one had wanted to, is simply assumed whenever one acts, because you can't act without having a desire to act anyway. In fact, Hobart says that all laws are hypothetical, right? Things like physics, simple ideas like if you drop the chalk, it will fall. That's a law of physics. So you let go of the chalk, it falls to the ground. And that's the way that laws work. If you had the desire to do something, you would have done it, right? So the ability to do otherwise, according to Hobart, is then built into our idea of freedom, and we have it. It's assumed. That's how laws work, and this is a deterministic law we're talking about when we're talking about acting freely. Okay, so put this together a little bit more. Hobart explains how this causal sequence works. We kind of ran through it when we did the argument for compatibilism, but let's think about it more clearly here. You have this internal causation that determines one's free action. Now, what's the sequence that's going on? Well, Hobart says we start with a wish, or I would prefer that he used the word desire. He uses the word wish. It seems a little different there. I think he would be fine with the use of desire, at least in our contemporary context. So you have a desire, and he says that causally determines what one wills. And what one wills, in turn, causally determines your action. So you have this causally determined sequence of actions leading to your action. Now, in terms of the ability to do otherwise, or the ability of someone to predict what you're going to do, which seems like would be reasonable in this description of how free actions work. Well, if that's how they work, I can predict exactly how somebody else is going to act. And if somebody can predict exactly how you're going to act, typically that causes some questioning of whether or not you're actually free. So Hobart addresses this squarely. He says, look, the capacity to predict what one will do is of value, right? It takes nothing away from our freedom or responsibility. It is a good thing. Instead, it can be a complement of one's character, right? So if you say of someone, you find out somebody's going to be bribed, you know, the mayor is going to be bribed, and you know the mayor is of good character, and so you say, he won't take the bribe, right? Well, that's a compliment to the mayor's free actions that he wouldn't do that. Let's look briefly at a different concept here, fatalism. So Hobart addresses this, and Hobart rejects fatalism. Now, fatalism is a little different. The story of Oedipus Rex is a story of fatalism. So if you're familiar with that, you know the story of how he was fated to marry his mother and kill his father, which, of course, it's an ancient Greek play, so those kinds of things happened in ancient Greek plays. You could think of it this way. Fatalism is the idea that, okay, somebody tells you you are going to die by falling from the Eiffel Tower. And so you think to yourself, well, that's easy to avoid. I just won't ever go to the Eiffel Tower, right? And then through a convoluted series of events, you end up at the Eiffel Tower and you think, well, I'll just look at it from afar. And then there's another convoluted series of events and you end up falling from the Eiffel Tower. It didn't matter what you chose to do, what you wanted to do, you ended up falling from the Eiffel Tower. Now, Hobart rejects that idea, right? He says that's not determinism. According to determinism, what you do is quite relevant to what happens. There, it's like no matter what you would do, you're going to end up falling from the Eiffel Tower. You can stay in North America, but somehow you end up falling from the Eiffel Tower somehow, some way, right? But he says, no, that's determinism is not like that. His view of compatibilism is not like that. Your actions are determined by what you do, right? What I do tomorrow is determined no matter how I struggle. That's fatalism. But for determinism and compatibilism, what I do tomorrow is determined through my struggle. So there's a difference there. It's like no matter what you try to do with fatalism, you're going to end up doing this one thing. With determinism, what you do is determined by your struggle, by your choices, by your character. And so it's not fatalism. He's rejecting fatalism. Let's consider briefly determinism and responsibility. We already mentioned that his compatibilistic view, not only is freedom compatible with determinism, but moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. And sometimes those are separated, like John Martin Fisher would affirm one but reject the other. So our actions, says Hobart, must be determined by our character. Otherwise, we couldn't be responsible for what we did. But we do actions that we are responsible for. We are sometimes responsible for what we do. Hobart affirms that, and he says, contrary to his view, indeterminacy would undermine responsibility. If things are indeterminate, then how could you be responsible for what turns out that you do if it's completely indeterminate, according to Hobart, right? Now let's think about punishment before we go to wrap this up and move on to part two. Punishment, according to Hobart, is legitimate, even if everything is determined. Right? So even if one's life is fully determined and they are determined to go murder someone, punishment's still legitimate in that situation. First of all, Hobart would say in most cases, the person did it of their own free will, even though it was determined, of course, as a compatibilist, he says that. But the punishment serves two different purposes. And I think we're limiting ourselves to legal punishment as the ideal, but this would fit in with other types of punishment as well. So it provides a deterrence for the offender. You punish someone, that causes them to not do it again. So that's perfectly consistent with determinism. And punishment is a deterrence for other people. So you serve as an example of what not to do, and that prevents other people from following in your footsteps. And so, in fact, the purposes of punishment require determinism. There has to be that causal connection between the punishment and the deterrence. And we won't worry about, different theories of punishment. Here, clearly, Hobart is assuming a deterrence theory of punishment. There are of course, other views of why it might be legitimate to use punishment. But there has to be this causal connection between punishment and the deterrence, or punishment wouldn't work at all. And so we wouldn't use it. Hobart says it does have a legitimate role, and that's because of the causal laws that affect our actions. So that's Hobart, the reason for his compatibilistic position. In part two, we're going to look at some criticisms to his view.